giving you 5 easy tips that are guaranteed to have you hitting the mark when you're both choosing and following a recipe. I think all of these tips are important, but make sure you stick around for the last one, which to me is the most important, but also my favorite. Hi, my name's Alyssa, and I've been an ambitious home cook and food lover all of my life. But in the last 4 years, I decided that I really wanted to hone my skills and learn about the fundamentals of cooking and flavor building, so I did just that. I learned so much, and I feel like some of these tips might be useful to other home cooks or people who just are interested in food and learning. So if that sounds like you, make sure to stick around. I feel like there's a lot of unnecessary stigma and slander around following a recipe. It's like you're supposed to be able to know how to season until your ancestors tell you to stop. But what if that tip has just never really worked for you? Well, if you're not comfortable in the kitchen, and honestly, even if you are, I think you should embrace using a recipe. Even professional kitchens utilize recipes to make sure that there's consistency in the food that they cook. Recipes can serve as a guide throughout your cooking journey, but especially at the start when you're not that comfortable in the kitchen. But that brings us to our first tip. All recipes are not created equal. Recipes will generally assume some type of baseline of knowledge, and so this might mean that some may go more in depth than others. This doesn't mean that a more streamlined recipe is bad, it might just not be for you right now. I encourage you early on in your cooking career or in your cooking journey to seek more fleshed out recipes. Imagine if recipe A told you to sear something for 5 minutes, or just to sear something. Or if recipe B told you to sear something over medium-high heat for 5 minutes or until golden brown. Recipe B is the key. Things like cooking notes from the author or in-depth instructions are really the key that are going to help you make the link between not just doing something, but why you're doing something. And that right there is how you use a recipe to teach you how to cook. So you follow tip number 1 and you found your recipe. The next thing that I would tell you to do is to give the recipe a fair chance. When you pick a recipe, you want to read through it multiple times so you can really get familiar with what it's asking you to do. Walking through the recipe mentally will allow you to have some confidence when it's finally ready to turn on the stove and get to cooking. During this time, you also want to consider how long this recipe might take so you can go ahead and plan ahead and give yourself ample time so that you're not feeling rushed or constrained. There's nothing worse than trying to get something done and you don't have enough time and you're rushing. It just builds up the pressure. You don't need that. You don't need that type of energy. And in the same vein of giving the recipe a fair chance, you want to try and minimize the changes that you make to a recipe, especially the first time that you cook it. The recipe was written the way it was for a reason. Changing a recipe too much might make it difficult to pinpoint exactly what went wrong if the recipe doesn't turn out exactly the way that you expect. But also, changing a recipe too much might mean that you're missing out on flavor combinations and new tastes that you might not know that you actually like. Let me give you an example. Early on in my cooking career, I made Thomas Keller's butternut squash soup, and this recipe called for swirling in brown butter at the end. Well, up until this moment, I hadn't used brown butter in a savory application. I just used it for making cookies and stuff, so I was convinced that I wasn't gonna like it, and I was like, I'm just not gonna do that. Well, I decided to just go ahead and try a little bit of it on a spoon, and when I tell you guys that my mind was literally like blown, that one step with all the long days of cooking and steps, because that recipe took a lot, but with all the long steps, that one step of adding in the brown butter at the end, it's like it unlocked everything. It was such a key ingredient in that recipe, and if I had changed it, I would never known why. So I'm gonna tell you that definitely kind of humbled me. In that moment, it really hit me that I was using a recipe written by a world-renowned master chef. Moving on to tip number 3, which is super important, so much so that you will hear this over and over and over again. Prepare the ingredients before you start cooking. This is also called mise en place. I don't know how to say that, but basically this is French for putting in place, and this is a key step. You will hear this over and over again. Having everything prepared beforehand is going to do a couple things for you. A, it's going to make sure that you actually do have everything that you need for this recipe that you've decided to start cooking, and B, it'll make the process a lot more stress-free. And when I say prepared beforehand, I'm not just limiting it to the ingredients. I also have a utensil bucket that I keep near me that has my key utensils, and something like that will allow you to make sure that you're prepping not only the ingredients, but you're also prepping the tools that you need. This is going to make sure that you avoid, you're cooking and the recipe tells you to add in the chopped up tomatoes, but at this moment now you're looking for the knife and now you're looking to chop the tomatoes at the moment that you're supposed to be adding in. Timing can be really critical in cooking, so you want to make sure to avoid things like that. If if you have everything prepped beforehand, that is just something taken off your plate. It'll make the process go a lot smoother. And now we're moving on to tip number 4, which to me is also key. This is like neck and neck with tip number 5. This is one thing that I've realized has really made a big difference in my cooking journey, and that is to cook with your senses and not just numbers. Learning this step literally took my food from this to this. Before we get into this tip, it might seem like it's contradictory to tip number 2, which was to make sure that you follow the recipe exactly the first time, but this is a little bit of a key difference. I'm not saying to change the ingredients, I'm saying to pay attention to how you're cooking. If you follow the first tip and you found a recipe with visual cues, this is going to be even easier for you. So say for example, a recipe tells you to sear something, but another recipe tells you to sear something or until golden brown. That golden brown right there is the key. A recipe is not just a series of instructions for you to robotically follow. It is supposed to serve as a guide to making delicious food, and just doing everything step by step and sequentially, if you're not actually making sure that the steps are turning out right, is not going to give you the right results. So let's go back until this seared until golden brown. What does this look like? How are we going to use our senses here? Is the chicken still looking pink? Is it still looking raw? If you feel it, if you touch it, is it firmer to the touch, or is it still soft and like, raw chickeny? Does it smell like it's cooking? Are the flavor aromas like starting to reach you? These are the things that you want to pay attention to as you cook, because that's really key to making sure that you have a good end result at the end of the day. You want to keep this tip in mind because recipes are written within the context of a writer's own home, a writer's own appliances, or writer's own elevation. In fact, all of these things can really drastically affect the end result of your cooking. So unless like this was a really big cookbook, or maybe they're like a bigger cooking publication and they're testing the recipe multiple times and in different ways, if you're following a TikTok or a blog, they really might not have done that. So it's okay for you to make the necessary tweaks, like increasing your heat, cooking something for longer or less, just to make sure that you achieve the desired end result. When you're cooking with your senses, this is also a good time to make sure that you are tasting the food as you go, so that you are building your sense of seasoning, your sense of salt. And brings us to tip number 5, the most important tip, the most fun tip to me, is to taste everything. You want to eat everywhere, eat everything, be adventurous with your taste buds, guys. Cooking is fun, eating is fun, but the reason I'm telling you guys is not just because I love eating, which I do. The reason I'm telling you guys to do this is because what we're trying to do is build a mental flavor bank that you can refer to when you're reading a recipe, when you're cooking, when you're riffing in the kitchen and you're just trying to make something of your own. If you understand the way ingredients are used in multiple contexts and in the context that they're used, it's going to make your life so much easier when you're trying to follow a recipe. I'm gonna give you guys an example. One of my friends recently texted me. He was trying to make Nigerian chicken stew for the first time. And so the recipe called for ginger, and he didn't have ginger, but he Googled it, which is a good thing. You should Google as you go. But Google told him that you could sub ginger for cinnamon. And maybe in some applications this might work, but personally for me, I would not be putting cinnamon in my Nigerian chicken stew. So I told him, no, don't do that. And I was able to tell him that because I have a flavor bank that he had not built yet. He was not comfortable enough yet in the kitchen to know and recognize the context in which flavors are used. And so I'm not saying that you should stop ordering chicken nuggets and french fries every time you go out, but maybe I am saying you should stop ordering chicken nuggets and french fries every time you go out. Try something new. And it's not just limited to, increasing your food budget and eating out all the time. No. If you go to your friend's house and they offer you some food or they cook something, taste it. If you go to your aunt's house and they've made a whole Thanksgiving spread, taste everything, try everything. This isn't just limited to eating outside. This means that in your own home, cook a lot. Or whenever you're grocery shopping, pick up a new ingredient that you've never tried before. Try a new condiment that you've never tried before. All of these things are really going to help you in building your flavor bank. When you try new dishes, not only are you developing your sense of taste, it also starts to get your mind working. What do I like in this dish? What note am I picking up on that I'm really enjoying? What would I do differently if I made this myself? These are all the type of things that will get you becoming a more creative cook, a more comfortable cook. All of this to say, so the next time when you're reading a recipe and you're trying to make Japanese yakitori and the recipe tells you to add thyme and Nigerian pepper soup spice, like, you'll understand why this just doesn't make that much sense, because your flavor bank is built up and you understand how flavors work with each other. Let's remember, guys, that the joy of eating is in all the flavors and all the foods that we get to try. Like, take advantage of this. Just be adventurous with your palate, be adventurous with your cuisine. So, all cooks can agree that repetition is the best form of practice for any home cook. And a recipe is really a great way to do that and get some steps in the kitchen, for lack of a better word, and get yourself familiar and comfortable in the kitchen with a guide right there. The more recipes you follow, the more techniques that you'll learn, and the more you'll realize why those techniques are used in certain ways. So there you have it, guys, 5 tips done. There's nothing wrong with using a recipe, but some are more beneficial than others, that I do believe. And if you are following the guide in this video, you'll be sure to make sure that you're using recipes to do what you actually need to do, which is to teach you how to cook. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to stick around for more information like this.